So this talk's called History of Resistance to Einstein's Relativity. I found an interesting video that deals with the history of resistance against Einstein's relativity. It doesn't deal with all the history of that resistance, and unfortunately it deals with it from a Christian perspective. This is the video title. And the talk is by Dr. Philip Stout.
Herbert Dingle was a professor of physics. He was an expert on evolution, on relativity. He wrote books on relativity. But he pointed out a problem. In the language of mathematics, one can tell lies as well as truth, and it can be very difficult to tell one from the other. Now, he wrote this when he had come across the problem of Einstein's relativity. The problem with that is it pushes mathematics to deal with something other than the reality which we live in. And once it deals with a realm that we don't actually live in, we can't see what's right and what's wrong. And he was very concerned because he had a very simple demonstration that Einstein's relativity was not true. And he came to the point of realizing what actually others had realized before him. Scientists have relapsed into imagining how nature ought to behave and then assuming that she does so. You remember the reason why Bacon put forward the reason for the scientific method? Because the creation behaves the way God made it, and we think it should behave the way we want it to behave. And now the mathematicians have gone back to making things work in their mathematics the way they think it should work. And he points out the factor which has made this possible is the exchange of reason for mathematics. Now, in science, you need mathematics as a tool. You cannot replace reasoning with mathematics. Mathematics has become the master of science instead of the servant.
So the person being referred to is Herbert Dingle. He was an English physicist and so forth, and he opposed Einstein's special theory of relativity. So the point is, it can write a lot of nonsense using mathematics. And the trouble is that to many people, any type of mathematics is a blind spot. And those supporting Einstein's relativity seem to have exploited that blind spot in writing a lot of nonsense.
Now, why did this happen? Right through history, mathematics and science were intertwined because they were dealing with the same thing. They were dealing with reality. In science, you observe the reality. In mathematics, you try and make sense of your observations about reality. But mathematicians rebelled against working to describe and analyze the Creator's creation. In the 18th century, a great project among the mathematicians arose to free mathematics from the creation. they hated the idea that they were restricted by the Creator to what mathematics could deal with. Secular humanist mathematicians demanded to be autonomous.
I think the mathematics he's referring to that he doesn't like is the non-Euclidean geometry, imaginary numbers and so forth, things like that. All those sort of innovations got incorporated into physics. Now jumping over his sermon bit about men wanted to be gods, etc., and going on to his next bit of science.
Now, one of the chief protagonists in this was Leopold Kronecker, and he, along with the others, was searching for a basis for mathematics, and after his thorough search, he came to the conclusion that the basis for mathematics is the integers, the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you cannot get away from that, and they are God-given. So God made the integers, all else is the work of man.
So the person being referred to is this person, Kronecker. He's a German mathematician, and he said God made the integers, all else is the work of man. So God is being brought into this issue about mathematics stroke science. It was a tendency by people of those days to think about things in terms of God, religion. Not everyone agrees, of course, with the claim that God made the integers, or else is the work of man. Some people interpret God as infinity and he's beyond our experiences and so forth. But God made the integers, or else is the work of man, is being used to state the claim that don't believe in infinity and the mathematics associated with that.
Now, the next person on the scene in this quest is Georg Cantor, and he said, Kronecker needs God, I do not. So he built a basis for mathematics on infinity. Now, infinity is not a God-given entity.
So Cantor was also a German mathematician, and he's the one in dealing with a lot of the issues about infinity. An interesting thing about Cantor is that he went mad. Whether he went mad thinking about infinity is arguable. Cantor brought in a lot of modern mathematics thinking about infinity. Dr. Stout wants to reject it for religious reasons. But there are verses in the Bible that seem to imply God is infinite. However, let's not go into that religious track and continue on.
It's a construct of the mathematician's mind. You can't point to infinity.
So, unfortunately, still on religion, he refers to can't point to infinity, but admits saying can't point to God either. Unfortunately, he wants to continue interpreting from the perspective of his personal belief in God when there are other interpretations of God.
It is a limit. And in order to actually define what you mean by this limit, which is infinity, it takes an awful lot of words to try and define it.
Right, so he's still on God, and what of the possibility that God is the limit and that God is outside our universe? It would take a great deal of effort to define God. People just have different interpretations.
And this was one of the objections that Kronecker put forward. He said Cantor is corrupting the whole of this system, and you can't build mathematics on an object which you can barely define. It's not a suitable basis. It's not a reality. But the mathematicians who wanted to get away from the creation loved it. They said, aha, here we've got our way to get away from the creation. And famous among them was a very well-known mathematician called David Hilbert. And he said, no one shall expel us from the paradise which Cantor has created for us. And he really jumped upon this basis for mathematics. And if you've got a mathematics which is built on a construct of a mathematician's thinking, there is no corresponding thing in reality to infinity. It's a mathematical limit. You are building your mathematics on something which doesn't have to correspond with reality at all.
So I disagree. Infinity can just simply mean start counting 1, 2, 3 and don't stop counting. So disagreeing now with what he wants to mean by infinity, and so cutting out more of the religious stuff. This is David Hilbert. He's another mathematician, and part of his idea was to try to explain everything by mathematics, but that idea is shattered by the incompleteness theorem. Mathematics is incomplete, hence can't explain everything. So this person, Gödel, another mathematician, who came up with the incompleteness theorem and basically showed mathematics can't deal with everything.
And he produced a theorem called the Incompleteness Theorem, which proves that any kind of mathematics will always produce propositions that cannot be shown to be true or false. You can always get answers which you can never know if they are true or false. Mathematics itself cannot tell you. The mathematician will have to decide between these results, because the mathematics itself cannot tell you which results are true.
Right, okay, next is going to be about Lewis Carroll. This is Dodgson. He was writing under the pen name of Lewis Carroll, and his famous stories about Alice Adventures in Wonderland and its sequel Through the Looking Glass. So he was a mathematician, and Lewis Carroll was mocking the new mathematics with its infinities and so forth when he was writing his fantasy stories of Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. So what we've got to do now is go down the rabbit hole.
Is surprised by something this Red Queen says, but a hill can't be a value, no. That would be nonsense. Now anybody skilled with the present mathematics immediately says, oh yes, it's just a simple transformation. But to someone who's dealing with the real world, the hill cannot be a value. Now, this mathematician says, you may call it nonsense if you like. I've heard nonsense compared with which that would be as sensible as a dictionary.
So I cut out one example that he points out because it's not a very interesting one. But on the example he is dealing with here, he's pointing out what he considers to be a nonsense transformation on a hill. He thinks that this type of mathematics can lead to what appears nonsense and impossible. The problem with the hill is how is the term hill to be defined, and in the mathematical sense the transformation illustrated, a mathematician wants hill to mean something other than how it's commonly meant. So there's a difference between what's commonly meant by terms and what a mathematician wants to mean by those terms. Mathematicians are cutting away from the usual physical interpretation. So now cutting ahead with what he's saying in the talk and not fully agreeing with him and getting back more onto relativity.
Example. Einstein said there is no more commonplace statement than that the world we live in is a four-dimensional space-time continuum. To a mathematician, well, that's obvious. No question. Now, most people might think, what is a space-time continuum? It's four-dimensional. What are those four dimensions? Well, let's look at those four dimensions. One is length. Well, we know what length is. One is breadth. We know what breadth is. One is height. And the fourth dimension, imaginary time multiplied by the speed of light.
Right, so relativity is not always formulated in terms of imaginary time. So that's another problem. Can formulate relativity in terms of different mathematics. What Dr. Stout is disagreeing with, I think, is imaginary numbers. He's disagreeing with the square root of -1. He doesn't want to accept that sort of mathematics. It's disappointing that he thinks that way. There are others who think in a similar sort of way and are anti what the mathematics is evolved into. And their point of view in opposing relativity is to be anti the mathematics being used by relativity. For myself, I just accept the different mathematical systems, and so now cutting on to the next bit.
On Cantor's basis for mathematics, anything goes.
He thinks that the mathematics is opposed to lets anything goes, but that's false because even that mathematics has rules restricting what is allowed. So trying to get back now on track.
This is perfectly sensible to a modern mathematician. He's basing his whole project on the figment of a mathematician's imagination.
So he wants to say figment of a mathematician's imagination, but it's really a case of what type of mathematics should be applied to physics. So they're cutting out about his false belief about not believing in infinity.
We've got a problem here. If we do some calculations in this four-dimensional space-time, we get some answers. Are we in any position to tell which, if any, of those answers are meaningful? Are any of them meaningful? Are they all meaningful? What the mathematician does is he says, the mathematics is correct, all those answers are true. Because within itself, mathematics has no way of telling which of its propositions are true, which are false, so the mathematician chooses he's going to believe them all.
It's something like that. It's about applying mathematics to physics, but then he mocks it as being impossible. But in a cut to
Frederick Soddy was a very famous Nobel Prize winner, and he gave an address to the Nobel Prize winners of 1954, and he was very concerned about this, and he used most of his address to point out the folly of accepting what the mathematicians are saying instead of using scientific reasoning. And he said, while there is no objection urged against mathematicians doing whatever seems good to them in their own sphere, quite definitely they should be stopped from presenting their whims as science, let alone pretending that in the last analysis they are the real scientists. But in spite of warnings like this, this is exactly what has happened.
So, what he's referring to is Frederick Soddy. He was an English radiochemist who explained to Rutherford that radioactivity is due to transmutation of elements.
Now, Professor Brian G. Wallace was a physicist, and he was really concerned about this. He was dealing with things that are usually dealt with by relativity, and he found it gives totally wrong answers, and he was amazed that invalid mathematics had taken over science, and he wrote a book. Now, he only dared write this book when he knew he was dying, because the scientific mafia would have thrown him out. They would have dismissed him from his job and made sure he never got another one. But he knew he was dying, so he wrote this book and he put it on the internet. It's free, you can go and download it. It's a very good book. It's called The Farce of Physics. And it's an easy read to book. It's an easy book to read. The word scientist entered the English language in 1840, and few individuals earned a living doing research, with most of the investigations carried out by gentlemen of wealth and leisure. At that time, a handful of American scientists were taking steps to transform the status and image and separate themselves as professionals from those they considered amateurs. The major tactic used to create this artificial separation has been the elaborate use of technical jargon and complex mathematics. This erection of higher and higher barriers to the comprehension of scientific affairs is a threat to an essential characteristic of science, its openness to outside examination and appraisal. And because of this, modern theoretical physics has become to a large degree little more than an elaborate farce.
Which is true, and it's not just in physics. So the person referred to is Brian Wallace, and his book is on the internet. It's called The Farce of Physics.
And it's not just in physics. He's talking about the farce of physics. If he had been in another discipline, he could easily have talked about the farce of other branches of science. Why? Because science has demanded ever higher levels of science, of mathematics, to separate them from the public, to increase their status. Everybody looks up to scientists because, wow, this is difficult stuff. They must be very clever. And to them, the more complex the mathematics, the better. The more you will be revered, the harder the mathematics to understand. That's just what the scientific establishment wants. And the fact that this mathematics has no real bearing on reality doesn't worry them at all.
Right, so science has been messed up. Dr. Stout continues, but unfortunately he is taking the point of view that problems in science came about because of change he's made from when science was dominated by Christian beliefs to what it is now. So he's taking a religious point of view on things. People have pointed out that Einstein's relativity doesn't make sense, but usually they get ignored. From my point of view, this abuse of maths is being used to create this mess in Einstein's relativity. So Dr. Stout's talk is generally along the correct lines of what happened with the resistance to Einstein's relativity. It was what happened with mathematics that created this mess. Mainly mathematics created this mess, I mean. Finished, thank you.